public universities have seen a and recently there's a little bit of an uptick, but since the Great Recession, I think we're looking at something like a 25% reduction in legislative or public dollar support for state universities. And for instance, in Louisiana, which is a combination of the Great Recession and oil, right? Public university support, so the number of dollars that came to the Louisiana State University system through the legislature accounted for about 60% of their budget before, and now about 25%. So that's one of the worst case scenarios. So again, everybody, all universities for the most part are seeing this erosion. And a lot of that, you know, is because of this very intentional belief, largely coming out of conservative quarters, that everything performs better when privatized. One way of privatizing higher education is to start pulling the rug out from state and federal funding, right? And so we see this I think it's a very intentional move toward privatization. And again, it's the notion that the market will do a better job, which I think is a disastrous assumption. But the point is that funding's going down, so there's these three options. You can cut faculty and staff. Well, you start looking around and you think, well, God, all of a sudden, you know, tenure is not a guarantee if they close my department, which is true of most universities. What department are they going to go after? Well, the one that caused trouble, the one that upset the industries, the one that interfered with the big donors, right? Or the one that's pleasing the donors, that's pleasing the industries, right? And so that's a lovely formula for self-censorship, right? Is start looking at jobs disappearing, right? Well, you know, you're going to go down your little hidey hole and not stick your head up very often, right? So you could do that. You can raise tuition. My worry there, of course, is as public institutions raise tuition, higher education becomes a privilege of the wealthy, all right? And again, who are the wealthy, but the sons and daughters largely of those in corporate positions, and et cetera. So that becomes a sort of self-fulfilling system. And then the third option are these large private, they call them gifts. I think of them sort of as investments. There's usually some sort of string or some sort of assumed quid pro quo involved. And so now we end up with School of Energy. We end up with the ConocoPhillips School of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Oklahoma. Right? So we have these named institutes and schools named after major corporations. Well, you know, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, right? And it would be weird if they did, right? So wouldn't it be strange that the one altruistic thing on the planet turns out to be corporations? The rest of us are greedy bastards, but they know they're the good guys, right? So, I mean, that would be pretty naive. So of course they have an interest. Of course they have an interest in the sorts of work that's going on there. And so the autonomy, the reliability, the independence of scholarship, and even what's taught in classrooms, and what's said on campuses, is becoming more and more privatized. Now the weird thing is that's coming from the right and from the left. We have trigger warnings, hate speech policies, and efforts to kick conservative commentators off campus before they can give public speech. So universities are in this weird position of having demands of censorship coming from both the liberals and the conservatives. And it makes you wonder who's actually going to fight the good fight for free speech. The best defense against a biased education, right, is not trying to flatten, right, the content of courses. It's to assure that there is rigorous, continuous, and intensive education with regard to critical thinking. So rather than I would rather we develop in our students their capacity to defend themselves against bullshit, right, than for us to become the filters of what it is they can hear in the classroom. Well, right, and so this one story that I tell that drew me into this whole thing. So there was this artwork on campus. It was called Carbon Sink, right? It was formed by these beetle-killed trees formed into logs that spiral down into a pool of coal, right? And so it drew the connection between climate change, the death of Wyoming forests, and the coal industry. And this is what the energy industry demanded be removed. It was removed, sort of almost in the dark of night, generated this huge kerfuffle, as it ought to have. And in reaction to that, our student senate, so a student government, all campuses have one of these, they had brought before them a piece of legislation that would have reiterated, stated, confirmed the need for academic freedom, right? And in essence, pretty explicitly condemned the university administration for countenancing the destruction of art, all right? And when that came to them, I was there. There was quite a debate, and the phrase that still haunts me, and it's the phrase that won the debate, was the students who said, well, I talked to the legislators, right? And what they said is, you know, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, right? And so the students, you know, who pay very low tuition because of, at that time, because of very high revenues in the fossil fuel industry, saw themselves as bought and paid for, right? They were domesticated animals. Their food bowl was filled every day, right? And it didn't cost them very much. And it was because of the oil, gas, and coal industry. And so the warning was, well, you know, do you want to bite the hand that feeds you? Now, when I talked to the president of the student senate, I said, what did that mean to you? And he sort of resisted at first. And I said, well, God, when I was a student, right, the goal was to shred the hand that fed us, right? It was to question, it was to demand, it was, you know, it was to doubt, it was to be skeptical. I said, what does that imply? You know, and he did pause, and he said, yeah, he said, it is more worrisome than I had taken it to be. The vote lost, the motion lost by a single vote. And so they did not take to task the university administration for censorship, because to do so would have been to send a message of ingratitude, as if the oil, gas, and coal industry paying their taxes somehow warranted generosity. Right? As a matter of fact, just a little bit off subject, but it's really important. So in Wyoming, the oil, gas, and coal industry have done a very good job via radio ads and whatnot of painting themselves as being generous supporters of the state, right? Of paying this severance tax. And as a colleague of mine, who's actually an attorney in the Department of History, points out, they no more pay the severance tax than the loaf and jug, which is our version of 7-Eleven or whatever you want to call it, right? They don't pay sales tax, right? So the owner of Mini Mart, right, doesn't say, oh, what a great guy I am because I pay all this sales tax. He collects a sales tax from the people who buy the product, all right? And that's good. I mean, he's supposed to do that, and he passes it up to the state. The oil, gas, and coal industry don't pay the severance tax. They collect it from the end user, the consumer, all right? So there's no, I mean, they are no more generous to the state of Wyoming, right, than the convenience store owner is generous for paying sales tax. But again, if you control the discourse, if you control the language, if you control speech, right, you can shape the impression of people as to what you're doing and what you're not doing. So this is like one of my great head-scratching wonders, right? And that is free speech, the First Amendment, right, should be the common ground of left and right, conservatives and liberals, right? Conservatives, you know, claim to be constitutionalists. They love the Constitution. They fight for the Constitution, right? And then they countenance censorship, right? And the liberals, well, we're all about freedom. We're all about liberty, right? Except we don't want you to use hate speech, and we want you to put trigger warnings in your classes. Oh, and you can only say potentially offensive things in this corner of campus. Oh, and by the way, if Ann Coulter comes on campus, we will protest and shout her down, all right? And it's like, oh my God, do you not hear yourselves, right? So is this a battle for who gets to censor? What, are you not listening to the other side? I mean, to me, it's sort of like this, in my world of ideology, it's my grand unifying theme. I mean, we even consider it, the United Nations considers it a human right. This isn't just something encoded in our Constitution. I mean, there's fields in philosophy where of course, we don't want to equate what is moral with what is legal. So we, as philosophers, would stretch this notion of free speech, as John Stuart Mill did, even further than the Constitution would. And so it sounds like, you know, from the foundations of Western civilization through the left and the right, the Constitution and the United Nations, we ought to all be able to rally around free speech, and what we're rallying around is who gets to control it, not who gets to free it. I did that with a graduate student. I was telling them about this, and you know, they call these, you know, bubbles, right? Internet bubbles, right? And so what the internet has done is sort of reinforce your biases, right? And so I was saying, yeah, and so, I mean, this guy he's young, right? Probably politically more or less like me, right? Socioeconomically, I got a lot more money than he does because he's a graduate student. So we just did that, right? And what did I think we typed in, what did we type in? I think we typed in Israel. Right? Ready, set, go into Google, right? And then we just read off, right, the top 10. And I think 6 were in common, but none of them were in the same order. Obviously, they know my income because I got travel. He got none. And so, I mean, yeah, so the idea, I mean, the internet, the promise of the internet, right, was that we would be able to work against our biases, right, because we would have information. And what it's done is simply entrench, polarize, and affirm our pre-existing biases. And it's, I mean, that's one of the grand disappointments of the internet. Well, God, right, and so if it wasn't bad enough, right, if it wasn't bad enough, we now are going to abandon net neutrality. So it wasn't bad enough that we had put ourselves into these bubbles. Now people can buy our bubbles. Well, they just took a page out of the book, right? And so what you do is you create echo chambers, right? So you put out false information, you let it bounce around. You let one media pick it up and they pass it to another, and that just sort of bounces around, right? And then you sow the seeds of uncertainty. You become a merchant of doubt, right? And actually the tobacco industry was very good at it, but it was actually picked up by the acid rain folks. So all of the legislation having to do with acid rain was also slowed down. So what you want to do is sow false information, sow doubt, sow uncertainty, confusion, ambiguity, and slow things down. Make things go slowly. You can grind the process to a virtual halt by saying one more study, one more study, one more study. We want good science. We're really in favor of science. Let's fund another study. And so there's a whole package of tricks, and I don't think any one of them did the fossil fuel industry fail to pick up on.